and welcome to Human Anatomy. We're going to start off with just an overview of what anatomy is, as well as some terminology that we are going to need as we go through this entire course. So let's go ahead and just get started and talk about some expectations and some objectives for this chapter. So what we want to cover in this particular chapter is we want to talk about anatomy and physiology and what are the differences, as well as some of the branches that we find in each. We're also going to talk about the structure of the body, how we go from simple to complex, and the different levels of organization that are in between. We're going to talk about what characteristics there are for human life, so what characteristics do we need to meet to be considered alive, and we're going to really put a heavy focus on one of those, which is homeostasis. And we're going to see homeostasis come back, especially in the next class. We'll see it in anatomy, but you'll really put an emphasis on this when we get to physiology later. But we're going to talk a little bit about it now so that we understand not just the how things work together, but also kind of give ourselves some context of why are things set up the way they are within the human body. And then we're really going to put a focus on anatomical terminology so that when we talk about the body, we can use the appropriate terms to refer to body regions, structures, and directions. These are terms that you'll stick with for a while. So let's talk about anatomy and physiology. So we're going to compare anatomy and physiology first, including some specializations, and then look at the relationship between anatomy and physiology. So one of the big questions is, what is anatomy? Right? Anatomy is just the scientific study of the body's structures. So just looking at what components are there, what makes up those components, what different levels and layers do we have to those components. And we can break anatomy down into two kind of sides. Gross anatomy, which is large scale. So think about looking at the major body parts, looking at the muscles and bones that are found in an arm, right? They're visible without needing a magnifying glass, without needing a microscope, anything of that nature. We can see it with our own eyes. And then the microscopic anatomy side, this is where we're looking at things where we need to have something to help us, like a microscope. And so usually we think about what we'd be doing, at least in this class with microscopic anatomy, we're focused on tissues, right? What's going on? What type of cells do we see making up those larger components? So here we have two examples, right? And we're looking at the same kind of thing. We're both looking at parts of the nervous system. In this case, we're looking at the brain. And we have the gross anatomy on the left where we see the brain in its entirety, right? You can see a brain if one was put in front of you without a microscope. And then on the right, we have neuron cells, we have the neuroglia around them. This is the tissue side, this is the microscopic side. And what we see is the microscopic anatomy comes together to form the gross anatomy. And we'll talk about both sides of this. We'll put a heavier focus on the gross anatomy for the most part, but we will really talk about the microscopic anatomy as well. So you can't really study one without studying the other at this point in time. They kind of go hand in hand. Now physiology, this is kind of studying how these structures work. What's going on a chemical level, on a physical level with those structures? How do these structures do their jobs, right? So that's the big difference between anatomy and physiology. Anatomy focuses on what is there. Physiology focuses on how does that thing work, right? But they do link together. You can't really talk about the physiology if you don't have the anatomical background. And so physiology puts a focus, like I mentioned earlier, on homeostasis. How do we maintain that for the most part? Because that's going to be all the different chemical reactions, all the different physical things that happen to keep us alive, basically. And we've mentioned the word homeostasis a few times now, but we actually really haven't defined it. So let's do that really fast before we go on. But homeostasis is what the slide says here, the state of steady internal conditions maintained by living things. What does that mean in layman's terms? Basically, we want to stay at a certain level. We want to stay within a certain range. So let's say we're talking about temperature. Our body does not want to get too hot or too cold. And so our body will do things to prevent us from getting too hot, to prevent us from getting too cold, to keep us within the normal range. So we think of homeostasis, we think of a pretty tightly regulated range of what's considered normal, right? And when we say normal, we're talking about like temperature, pH, solute concentrations, things of that nature. We have these tight-knit ranges that we stay in. And if you go outside of those ranges, you start to feel sick, right? You start to feel ill. And if you really go outside those ranges, then you can feel really sick and even die, right? So this is really important that our body stays within these parameters. So why are we talking a little bit about physiology now when this is an anatomy class? And the reason is that they're very tightly linked. Structure and function are inherently linked because the structure of the tissues, the structure of the body parts will help determine the function it performs. So if we look at the small intestines in our example here, there's important features to the structure of small intestines that allows it to do its job. So we think about the small intestine, their job is to absorb nutrients, to get as much of the nutrient content from the food we eat as possible. And there's components, there's things involved with the small intestine structure that give the small intestine its ability to do that. And so, for example, we have villi and microvilli that increase the surface area. That increased surface area allows us to maximize the nutrients being absorbed. That's the function. Nutrient absorption, the structure is the villi and the microvilli. So structure and function go hand in hand. We can't really talk about the functions of organs, the functions of tissues in detail without understanding the structure first.